2018's theme is going to be Wild West. Um, we're going to be taking a look at all the vehicles submitted, and we'll be taking a look at the textures, furnitures, tire stickers. We're going to be looking at everything. I'll be rating everything from 1 to 10 for my own personal preference, and also how likely it is to get into the game. Let's start off with the Pagani. I've seen this vehicle clickbaited quite a lot. Um, I don't believe it has anything to do with the season. The car is obviously quite well made. Just by looking at the screenshots, you can tell a lot of effort has been put into this vehicle. But I out of my own personal preference, I'd rate it a 9 out of 10. But it has nothing to do with the season theme, so I unfortunately would rate it as quite unlikely to get into the season. Next off, we have the Outlaws Rage. Um, this vehicle is quite interesting because it's one of the only submissions I have seen that actually have an element of horses. Horses aren't actually allowed in the Western season, even though it would fit in quite well with the theme. So I'm glad someone managed to try to incorporate a horse, but it's still kind of like a vehicle. Um, the pictures are quite well. Um, like they aren't that good graphically compared to the other ones I've seen, but there's some detail in this, and I kind of like we never have had like a carriage type vehicle inside Jailbreak, so I do think this would be quite nice to see. Personal preference wise, I'd probably say this is like a 7 out of 10. Um, in terms of the vehicle actually being added to this season, I'd probably give this a higher score than the Pagani. Um, this realistically, like in order for it to be added to the game, I'd probably say like 6.5 out of 10, which is pretty decent. It's better than Pagani, which I'd say was around 5. Actually, not 5, maybe 4. Next off, we have the Pioneer. We have the Pioneer. This isn't necessarily a vehicle that was submitted, but it was uh, a kind of concept thing. And I believe this would have been actually like the most likely car to have been added because it actually fits in so well with the theme of the Wild West. I think the vehicle actually looks really well made. Like there's quite a few customization options from what we can see. There's a lot of details in the front here. There's little flags right here. There's an interior. I'm assuming this can seat maybe like 3 people. Like one there and then 2 back here. Like this is a very solid car. In my personal preference, I'd say this is an 8 out of 10. Uh, if this was an actual vehicle submission rather than a concept, I'd probably give this an 8.5 out of 10. Next up, we have the Strago. It's like a pickup truck kind of vehicle. There's quite a few of these kinds of vehicles submitted to this season. In my opinion, I think the car doesn't look the best compared to some of the other submissions I've seen. But in my personal preference, I'd probably give this a 7 out of 10. Uh, as it and likeliness, I'd probably give it a 7. There are some better submissions out there though that I believe are a lot more likely. Next up, we have the Pagan. This vehicle is one of the most upvoted ones right now, with around 600. The vehicle obviously looks really good from the screenshots. There's a lot of detail, but like one thing that might make it difficult for the developers to add this is because it looks similar to the Rattler. The Rattler was, I believe, a season 4 vehicle, and it looks very similar, but I do think it's different enough to where it could be added. In my personal opinion, I'd probably give this like a 9 out of 10. Like it looks really well made, um, and this is something I'd actually like to see in the game. Next up, we have the Canyoneer. This vehicle is like doesn't have many upvotes, but I actually kind of like the concept that they came up with in the vehicle, because this vehicle's actually from the Lego movie. You know how there's like the Wild West scene? This is pretty much a replica of that car, and I find that incredibly creative because I would have not thought about that. And in terms of personal preference, like this is actually kind of an interesting vehicle. It's something creative and unique. I'd realistically give it an 8.5 in terms of likeliness, due to the like there's not many upvotes for this, so it's quite unlikely. So I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. Next up, we have the Raven Skull Buggy. In my opinion, this vehicle looks really well made, and it fits the season theme quite well. I really like how it looks. The interior could be better, but I do like the overall structure of the outside. It really elegantly fits together. So realistically, in terms of personal preference, I'd probably give it an 8. In terms of likeliness, I'd probably give this an 8.5. I think it's quite likely. Next up, we have the Desert Truck. Uh, I I picked a bunch of the season submissions just to so we can get like a wide range of cars to look at. Uh, this vehicle is a little bit on the generic side, and we already have a bunch of pickup trucks in the game. Tow truck, there's a pickup truck, tow truck, and there's the Raptor. So this submit like in terms of the vehicle, like in terms of looks, it looks poorly made actually. The interior is very basic. The steering wheel is a bit weird. There's no detail whatsoever on the inside. Um, I'd probably give this like a 3 out of 10 in terms of looks, and in terms of it actually making it into the game, probably like a 1 out of 10, unfortunately. Introducing the Longhorn. This is a card that has been heavily upvoted. One of the most highest upvoted ones of this season. The vehicle looks quite well made. It looks similar to the Challenger and Bandit, but I do think it is quite there's quite a few details which I really like that really makes this vehicle more on the Wild West theme, such as the horns on the front and obviously like the lasso on the back. The interiors is quite decent, and overall the vehicle actually fits in with the style of Jailbreak. And I do believe this is a better looking alternative than the Bandit. So, in my opinion, in my personal preference, I give this an 8 out of 10. And in terms of actually, like it actually making it into the game, I probably give it also an 8 actually, because I do think that it's very similar to the Bandit, obviously, but I do think it has a decent chance with the amount of upvotes and support it is getting. Next up, we have the Hunter. The Hunter is one of the pickup truck submissions of this season. It looks decent, in my opinion. It's much better than the other tow truck we saw earlier in this video. In my opinion, I probably, in terms of looks, give it a 6.5 out of 10. In terms of it actually making it to the game, I'd probably give it a 6. For the last vehicle we'll be taking a look at the Carter. The Carter is a very well made and detailed vehicle. The inside is one of the best I've seen in the game and actually fits really well with the season theme. I give it an 8.5 out of 10 in my opinion. In terms of actually making the game, I'd probably give it a solid 8. Starting off with the tire stickers, we have the Texas Chad tires. These rims, or not rims, tires, are quite well made, but there isn't really, it's not like a super creative idea. It does fit in with the theme. On my own scale, I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10 in terms of it actually making it into the game. Probably also a 5 out of 10. Next up, we have the True Bandit rims. Their tires, these tires are unique. They're not my favorite. I did prefer the previous ones a bit more. So my own personal preference, I would probably give it a 4 out of 10 in terms of it actually making it to the game. Probably a 3. Next up, we have the Enforcer tires. These tires are quite unique in my opinion with the bullet kind of curving like that. It does fit in with the theme. It's a bit higher up in my opinion. I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10, and in terms of making it, probably a 5. Lastly, we have the Moo Over tires. These tires, in my opinion, are the most likely to make it in the game, and I do think it's quite creative. Realistically, in my personal preference, I'd probably give it a 7. And in terms of making it the game, I'd probably give it an 8, most likely. Next up, we have furnitures. There are quite a bit of furnitures to go through, so I'll go through them quite quickly. So firstly, we have the Western background. There is actually quite a few season submissions that have a similar type format with wanted posters and like paintings. I do think it is a quite interesting idea. You could just have your characters stand behind it, and then yeah, I do think it's quite interesting. Uh, it's it's quite unique. So I have my personal preference 7 out of 10. In order for it to get added, I'd probably say 6. Next up, we have the carriage furniture. The carriage is quite generic, I guess, with this theme, but it fits the theme. It gets the job done. My personal preference, I don't think it looks the best, so I'd probably give it a 6. In terms of it making it to the game, I'd probably give it a 4. Next up, we have the Gatling gun. This actually has a little bit of upvotes, so it has a chance of making it into the game. The Gatling gun has a ton of detail put into it. Also, this screenshot is quite funny actually. I like it. In my personal preference, I'd probably give this a solid 8 or a 9. And then in terms of it actually making it to the game, I'd probably give it an 8. Next up, we have the Wanted Dead or Alive furniture submission. It's a pretty basic uh, looking thing, exactly how it's going to fit in as a furniture. It's decent, so I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. In terms of it making it into the game, probably a 4. The description does mention it, like it's pretty much the same thing as the spoiler they submitted, so it's pretty much a spoiler or furniture kind of item. So that's why it's fairly short like that. Up we have the Cactus Buddy furniture. It is a little bit on the generic side, but it's something that I kind of like. So in terms of my personal preference, I give it a 5. In terms of it actually making it into the game, probably 5 as well. Next up, we have the most wanted poster. I do think this is actually qu quite interesting to have in the game. There's already paintings and stuff in the game, but I do think this would kind of fit in with the lore of the game.
Just a theory. A game theory.
So it is a little bit higher up there in terms of my personal preference. So probably a 7 out of 10. In terms of it actually being added, probably a 6. The carriage bed. The carriage that we saw earlier uh, in the furniture section was lower quality compared to this one. So this one is a lot better, and I do like the detail that was put into it. So realistically, I'd give this a 7 out of 10 in terms of personal preference. In terms of it actually making probably 6.5. Next up, we have the wagon cart furniture. This furniture has a lot of effort put into it, and it's quite clear that this is one of the better furniture submissions. So I would probably give this an 8 out of 10, and in terms of it actually making in, probably an 8 as well. Next up, by the same creator, we have the choo-choo bed. The choo-choo bed is one of the best beds submitted to this season. It is quite unique, fits in with the theme, and probably would give it 6.5 in terms of personal preference. And in terms of it actually making it into the game, probably a 7. Next up, we have the rocking horse chair. It's a pretty basic item, so it's gonna be quite low on both scales. In terms of my personal preference, probably a 4. In terms of actually making the game, probably a 3. Next up, we have the outhouse. The outhouse is, you know, it, it's a well-made item. I do believe this has quite a lot of potential in making into the game, since it's kind of on the goofier side of things. So I'd probably, like, in my personal preference, I'd probably give it like an 8.5, because I think it's kind of funny to have the game. And in terms of it making the game, probably an 8. It's a solid season submission. Has a good chance of making it in. Next up, we have the old mansion painting. The old mansion painting is like it's similar to the other paintings that were submitted. It's definitely quite like this would definitely fit in with Jailbreak, but I don't know if it's best suited for this season, or rather it be like actually put in as a painting inside of the actual mansion, because I think that'd be a lot better. In terms of looks, there's it's a well-made screenshot thing. Um, I'd probably give it a 6.5 in terms of actually making the game. I think it's actually quite high up there. Probably like a 7, I believe, but not as a season submission, but rather as an object within the museum. Next up, we have the Pioneer Fridge. It's an I try to grab an assortment of like all the furnitures I could find for this season, and this is one of the ones that popped up. Realistically, it's not that uh, it's not that good looking. I'd probably give it a 5 in terms of actually making the game, probably a 3, unfortunately. So we have a painting with a train. The item is quite nice. It does fit in with the style of Jailbreak. In my personal preference, I'd probably give it a 7. In terms of actually making the game, probably a 6. The last furniture item we'll be taking a look at is the saloon bar. Um, this is a bigger furniture item, but big furnitures have been added in the past before, like the hero stand as well as the tiki bar. Those were quite big. But I do this fits in with the style of Jailbreak. It looks quite well made. I'd probably give it a 6.5 in terms of action making, probably a 6, because the developers are looking for something interesting that would get the most plays. We'll be taking a look at spoilers. So starting off, we have the revolver wing. The revolver wing is quite a basic looking spoiler in my opinion, but it fits to the season theme. Um, so in my personal preference, probably a 6 in terms of looks. I mean, there's not that much going on, or in terms of it actually making the game. There's not much going on. It's pretty much like a plank on top of two guns. So realistically, I'd give it a 6 out of 10 in terms of my personal preference, in terms of actually making it in the game, probably a 6.5. Next up, we have the Ol Steamer spoiler. This is one of the best spoilers submitted to this season. It pretty much transforms your car into a steam engine, which is quite interesting. And I think this is a really good chance of making it in. And this is one of my favorite ones as well. I probably, on my own personal preference, I'd probably give this a 9 in terms of it actually being added in this game. Probably 8.5. Next, we have the Tagalong carriage spoiler. I do believe this spoiler is way too big and is most likely not going to be added for this reason. So I'd probably give this a 5 in terms of personal preference, and in terms of actually being added to the game, probably a 2. Next up, we have the cowboy hat spoiler. I don't think this looks that good in terms of the other submissions, so this is realistically a 2 on my end. In terms of it actually being added in the game, probably also a 2. Next, we have the West windmill spoiler. It is an animated spoiler. We've seen these animated spoilers added quite a lot into previous seasons, so it's not super unlike the developers to add something like this. In terms of personal preference, for me, I'd probably give it a 7. In terms of it actually being added, probably a 7.5. Next, we have the Bullwing spoiler. The Bullwing spoiler pretty much transforms your car into a Western. A lot of the season cars submitted had these kind of horn detail in the front, so having it like this kind of spoiler kind of transforms your car into a Western like any car you have. It's quite interesting, and in terms of personal preference, I give this a 6. In terms of it being added, I probably give it a 4.5. Next, we have the Native Wing. The Native Wing spoiler is quite detailed. There's a lot of effort put into the feathers, into the gradients you can see here. And I probably give it a solid 7.5 in terms of looks. In terms of it being added, I probably say 8.5. It has a good chance. It has quite a few upvotes, so you never know, right? Next, we have the barrel wing. The barrel wing spoiler looks similar to like the water gun spoiler and like the cash spitter spoilers, and it tends to be these kinds of spoilers tend to be added in as the level 9 prize. So I'd probably say this is extremely likely to make it in. I'd probably give it a 9.5 in terms of it actually being put into the game. And in terms of looks for me, I'd probably say 8 because I've seen this kind of stuff before. But it's a good spoiler. We'll be taking a look at rims. So starting off, we have the barrel rims. These barrel rims look similar to the waffle rims, so I don't think they'll be added for that reason. It is quite an interesting idea, but it's kind of not obvious as to what it is when you look at it. So I'd probably say, in terms of looks, I'd probably give it a 6. In terms of it being added, probably a 5. There's a chance, but it's not a good one. Next, we have the cowboy rims. The cowboy rims look pretty good, but in my opinion, they're not as good as the other badge type rims that were added or submitted to the Reddit. So I'd probably give this a 6 or 6.5 in terms of looks, and in terms of it being added, probably a 6. Next up, we have the deputy rims. The deputy rims, we've seen these types of rims before in the form of like the ducky rims and like the beach ball rims. So I do think this has a chance of being added, probably like a 7. In terms of looks, I'm not a huge fan of them. Probably a 5.5. Next, we have the sheriff badge rims. I do believe this is a much better alternative than the other badge rims we were just looking at. I'd probably give this a solid 7.5. It does look similar to the other badge rims in the game, but this is like a newer revamped version, and I'd love to see this in the game. In terms of being added, I could see this as a level 5 submission, so good chance. I'd probably give it an 8.5 in terms of actually being added. Next up, we have the horse rims. These rims do have almost 500 upvotes, so it has a solid chance of making it in. They do look similar to the spinners, they look similar to the spinner rims, but regardless, I do think these are quite unique. We've never really like it fits in with the season quite well. I'd probably give it a 7 in terms of looks. In terms of being added, probably an 8.5. It's also pretty good. Next up, we have the gunslinger rims. Um, they they're based off revolver sin. Okay, next up we have the gunslinger rims. They they're meant to resemble guns like the cylinders within revolvers and stuff like that. Uh, it's quite decent, but I do think there's a much better alternative to these, so I'd probably give it a 5 in terms of looks. In terms of being added, probably a 4. Next, we have the train wheels. These are based off like steam engine wheels. It's quite creative in terms of the other rims that have been submitted, so I'd probably give it a 6.5 for that reason. But in terms of them being added, like I don't see them adding this. Probably a 3. Next, we have the duelist rims. I don't think these look that good at all. I think they're just trying to mimic like void rims and those kind of see-through type rims. So I don't see this being added at all because it doesn't look that good. And so for that reason, on both scales, we're going to put it at a 3. Next, we have the Stacko Dynamite rims. I'm not exactly sure if they'll have this particle, but it looks like they just photoshopped fire onto the end of it. But I do like the way they presented it. They literally just put the cargo ship like as a vehicle to put the rims on it. I think it's quite creative. So in terms of my personal preference, I would say 8. In terms of it being added, it's quite unlikely, so probably a 4. And for our last rim we'll be taking a look at, we have the old revolver rims. This is probably guaranteed to make it in. It looks so good, and for that reason, it's guaranteed. So for that reason, I'd say it's a 9 on both scales. This is guaranteed to make it in my opinion. Starting off, we have the cactus vehicle skin texture. I think this texture actually looks very good and is definitely one of the better green textures we have in the game. So for that reason, and it fits quite well with the season theme, I'd give it a 7 out of 10 in my opinion. And in terms of the action making of the game, I'd also give it a 7. Next up, we have the Western Sunset texture. This texture is actually quite nice. It reminds me of the fire texture we got in Season 1 and the carbon fire texture we have in the game as well. The gun design actually looks quite clean, if I'm being honest, and this is something that I'd like to see in the game. So, in my personal preference, I'd probably give it an 8. In terms of it actually making in the game, it's pretty much the same chance as the cactus texture, which is a 7 out of 10. Next up, we'll be taking a look at the sheriff texture. This texture is okay. It's not my favorite by any means, because I think it looks rather low quality. So I'd give it a 6 out of 10 in terms of its looks. In terms of it actually making in the game, I'd probably give it a 6 as well. Next up, we have the dusted rattlesnake texture. This texture does look quite decent. It does look similar to the dragon scale texture that we currently have, but this is quite nice. I'd probably give this a 6 out of 10 in terms of looks. In terms of it actually making it to the game, I'd probably give it a 5. Next up, we have the Western Silhouette texture. This texture is definitely one of the better ones submitted. Realistically, I'd probably give this a 7.5 out of 10 in terms of looks, and in terms of it actually making it to this game, I'd probably give it a 7.5 as well. Next up, we have the red bandana texture. This texture has a ton of support, 600 upvotes. This texture is pretty much guaranteed to make it into the game, and I do believe the texture actually looks quite nice. So in terms of looks, I'd probably give it an 8. And in terms of it actually making it into the game, I'd probably give it a 10 out of 10. This is guaranteed to make it in. There's also a blue variant, so I'm not exactly sure which one the developers would choose, but I do think they might choose the red bandana over the blue one, but I'm not exactly sure how they'll implement it, but they'll definitely implement one of them. Next up, we have the light oak and rich oak textures. These textures are quite nice. There's not many brown textures within Jailbreak, so a, like a new variant of that kind of color of texture is going to be quite appreciated. In terms of looks, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. In terms of it actually making it in, I'd probably give it a 4. It's not super likely, has a little bit of support, but I don't think the developers would add this over a texture like the bandana. So here we have a competing rattlesnake texture. In terms of the comparison between the two, I do prefer the other one a lot more since I do like the more defined scales in the other one. So I'd have to rate this one lower in terms of my preference compared to the other rattlesnake texture. This one is still quite a likely contender for for it to actually be making it into the game. So I'd probably give it maybe a 6.5 out of 10.